Thank you.
Yes. It's fantastic to be here, and I'm delighted to be able to talk to you about cities. You know, most of my life has been spent investigating generally positive things about cities, the ability that cities have to enable us to work together, to collaborate, to learn from each other, to find a market for our goods, to find an idea that you can borrow, to find a friend even. But there are also demons that come with density, and there is no more terrible demon of density than contagious disease, which is something that reappeared to us in 2020. Now, this is not a new phenomenon. We have had urban plagues, we've had well-documented urban plagues for 2,400 years, since 430 BCE, with the plague of Athens. Now, if you think about the backstory for the plague of Athens, the 5th century in that remarkable city, you see an example of a city doing all that you could possibly imagine that a city would do, right? In history, in drama, in philosophy, you have these remarkable combinations of talents that all work from each other, all learn from each other, all constantly play off of one another. Whether or not you think about Sophocles and Euripides bickering on a street corner, if your thoughts turn more readily to Socrates and Plato, either way, these are our amazing minds in a dialogue with one another, and that is only made possible by the city, both because of the city that brings them together and because the city provides a market for their talent. It is also a place that has Phidias' sculpture, the rebuilding of the Acropolis, and it has democracy, right? It has enormous economic success, it has enormous military success. Now, all of this triumph, right, then excites the rivalry of its land-based, military, non-urban rival, Sparta. Sparta demands that Athens back down from its leadership of the Delian League. Pericles, then leader of the Athenian democracy, is not willing to take guff from any human being and tells Sparta to get lost. If we're going to believe Thucydides, who was describing it in one of the great orations of all time. And so the war was on. Now, the strategy that Pericles uses is to summon the Athenians and their Attic allies behind the walls of the city, trusting in those walls to keep out the superior Spartan army, and then send forth the vastly superior Athenian fleet to harass the Peloponnesian coastline. Militarily, it was perfectly successful, but walls that can keep out enemy hoplites still let in bacteria, still let in viruses. And Athens is vulnerable. It's vulnerable to disease for two primary reasons. The first of which is it is this great node on the global lattice of travel and trade. This is exactly what makes cities vulnerable to disease in 2020 as well, right? The disease comes into New York, carried by Italian tourists, right? Secondly, in dense areas, at least then, right, the disease can hop easily from person to person. And that's exactly what happens. Thucydides, who was there, describes a city that has gone amok in which people live only for the day because they do not expect to see tomorrow. Now, perhaps 1/4 of the Athenian population dies in 2 years. That would be a death rate approximately 100 times that of COVID-19. So it's 100-fold what we've just gone through, right? Now, Athens soldiers on. It takes another 23 years after that to finally lose the Peloponnesian War. But it becomes dimmed. It becomes, it moves down from being the New York of the Eastern Mediterranean to maybe being the Baltimore, to maybe being the New Haven. And in some sense, its glory is dimmed forever. Now, one of the basic facts about natural disasters is their impact is always mediated by the strength of civil society in which things hit. Right? When plague comes again during the era of the 5 good emperors in the 2nd century CE, it's relatively harmless. The Antonine plague, even though millions are dead, but it's relatively harmless in terms of disrupting society. By contrast, in the 6th century, in the plague of Justinian, right, there's a maximalist interpretation of this, that this sort of derailed all of European history for 800 years. I'm not going to litigate that at this point in time. These arguments have been made. For most of the past 200 years, right, our cities have been exposed to some form of illness, and for most of the past 200 years, they've been relatively steady. This shows a path of death rates over the past over 200 years in New York City, and you can see the early 19th century was an early era of proto-globalization, and it was also an early era of proto-pandemic. Okay, the first decades were yellow fever, which was as a mosquito-borne illness, emerges out of Africa, gets carried up to the Caribbean, and then up to the cities of the East Coast in the 18th century. And then by the middle, after 1817, Ganges emerges in a particularly virulent form cholera emerges in a particularly virulent form in the Ganges Delta, okay? And cholera gets carried along with the English army, gets carried along with the Tsar's army, and it makes its way west. Death rates about 10 times that of COVID-19, but 1/10 that of the plague of Athens. Right? But yet, cities continue to strive. They continue to grow despite the awful death rates. Why? Well, there are two reasons, one of which is their enormous economic vitality. If your option is dying of starvation in Ireland in the 1840s or risking cholera in New York City in the same year, you're going to risk cholera. But secondly, and I think more upliftingly, cities made investments to protect their citizens. In fact, David and I have argued that, in some sense, the 19th century is a hinge of history in which governments start to save lives rather than just to take them. Right? We may all exult in the witty letters that Voltaire and Frederick the Great sent to one another, and isn't that lovely? But let's face it, old Fritz's main job was pillaging Central Europe and stealing from Maria Theresa. Right? It takes the citizens of Philadelphia in the 1790s, the citizens of New York in the 1820s, to start investing in the water-related infrastructure that would actually save lives, that would transform our cities and make them places of health rather than places of death. It took an enormous amount of coordination to do this. It was a popular movement. It took an enormous amount of money. America's cities and towns were spending as much on clean water at the start of the 20th century as our federal government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. Right? An enormous amount of money being spent on this. But it worked. It worked not just because of the infrastructure. In fact, you can look there. Croton, which is the sort of famous piece of infrastructure for New York, opens in 1842. New York continues to have cholera pandemics for 25 years after that. The reason for that is the last mile problem that still bedevils the cities of sub-Saharan Africa today, where I do work currently on water issues. You build the aqueduct, you don't provide a natural means for poor people to connect. You provide a couple thousand hydrants, but it's not enough. Water is hard to carry, and so they stick with their pit latrines, they stick with their shallow wells, and they continue to die. It's not until you have the Board of Health, which opens in 1866, which starts imposing quality standards on landlords. Right? You can see the connection between the sort of landlords between my talk and Matt, in which you actually fine landlords who don't connect to the water system, that you actually start getting clean water. You need to have incentives as well as institutions. Right? If you just build roads, right, you'll just get more driving. Right? You actually need to have a price on roads, just like you need to have an incentive for people to connect to the water system. But with those incentives, with that infrastructure, New York became healthier. Right? Over the course of the 19th century, the death rates normalized, and for much of the past 100 years, we've almost forgotten that urban pandemic has been a regular feature of human history. And then it happened again. Now, I got it. Okay. It happened again. Now, New York was vulnerable because it was the port of entry for tourists. But the crowding that had made Athens so vulnerable, the crowding that still makes the slums of Mumbai vulnerable, does not appear to be an issue in American cities today. So this is a map of cases per capita in the end of, let's say, the middle of 2020, let's say 4 or 5 months into the pandemic. You can see that the cases are least in Manhattan, least in Brooklyn Heights. They were most in the outer boroughs. They were most in Staten Island. They were most in the places where actually people had single-family detached houses, not most in urban apartments. Why? Well, this is the first pandemic in history in which we can really watch behavior. This is the decline in people leaving their houses as measured by cell phones. Right? You can see the real behavioral response is all towards the city center, not on the edges. Why? It's not that the people in the city center were somehow or other smarter, right? It's that they lived in industries, they worked in industries where they could go remote. They worked in knowledge industries, not in essential industries. They were highly skilled, they were highly educated, and so the technology worked better for them. It saved their lives. 68.9% of Americans with advanced degrees were working remotely in April of 2020. 5% of high school dropouts were working remotely in that same year. The Zoom revolution is not a thing that happened to everyone, and it's a thing which saved some people's lives and not others. This shows... Okay. Okay, great. This is what the result of this was. So along the x-axis, I have the share of the population with a college degree. Along the y-axis, I have COVID death rates. The remarkable thing is not that this slope is negative or even strongly negative. On almost every health outcome that we can think of, education tends to be protective. The remarkable thing is the slope. Okay, if you compare America's least well-educated metropolitan areas to the most well-educated metropolitan areas, the death rate is a 4-to-1 difference. Okay, in cities like Las Vegas, Oklahoma, San Antonio, Birmingham, these are places that are low on the education group. 0.4% of people died from COVID. In Seattle, in San Francisco, 0.1% died from COVID. It was an extraordinarily unequal event. More people died from fentanyl in Seattle over this time period than died from COVID. Now, looking forward, this relationship between skills and working remotely also helps us see through what will be the future of downtowns, right? Because the future of downtowns feels very different in those less well formally educated places than in San Francisco, than in Seattle. There are different ways of measuring the switch to going remote. But I would say at this point in time, most of the city leaders that I talk to are obsessed with this, and correctly so. Whether or not their downtowns will recover in some way, whether in some sense the work from home thing has basically challenged our model of urban life in a fundamental way. This is Castle Technologies. They run card swipes for large offices. Okay, so these are really fancy commercial buildings. These show a 50% decline relative to pre-pandemic in people going to work, and that stayed completely constant. Okay, that is very representative of high-end office markets. That is not representative of America as a whole. Okay, this one, the next one, whenever it comes up, the next one should show you the actual trend in, there we go, of teleworking from the CPS. So what this tells you is if you actually get a representative sample of Americans, this red line shows teleworked all hours. That's been relatively constant at 10% since for the last year. Telework some hours actually shows a slight upward trend. Okay, so the hybrid work, far from disappearing, appears to have been going up, but the share of people who are teleworking all the time seems to have been steady. Moreover, that has started to see an inverted hump with education. So the most educated people are not teleworking all the time at all. They need to be together. And I think that's sort of a clue to how I think about this. When we think about the prophecies of the urban doom loop, when we think about the idea that all this teleworking is going to make face-to-face contact in the cities that enable that contact obsolete, it's helpful to remember that this is not the first time this question has been asked. In 1980, Alvin Toffler wrote in The Third Wave that he expected the technology of its time to cause an urban escape as well, to turn our offices into deserts, to turn our workplaces into our homes. He was living in an era in which all of America's older, colder cities had been profoundly changed by evolutions in transportation technology. Right? Globalization, the rise of container ships, the rise of trucking had meant that our older, colder cities that were all built around transportation technologies. Every one of the 20 largest cities in America in 1900 was on a major waterway, from the oldest, New York and Boston, where the river meets the sea, to the newest, Minneapolis, on the northernmost navigable point on the Mississippi River. Right? Railroads had come to complement, to supplement those waterways, and great industries had grown up around it. The largest industrial cluster in the United States in the 1950s was not automobile production in Detroit. It was garment production in New York City, a child of the port. Those industries were hammered by globalization. They just left. They left the city in chaos. And so it was natural for Toffler and his compatriots and his fellow thinkers to wonder whether or not these technologies, right, remember this, IT of its day, right, the high technology of the 1980s, was going to kill off urban knowledge industries. But of course, it didn't. For 39 years, Toffler was completely and totally wrong. Okay? I've spent much of my life writing in the shadow of that and explaining why, far from marking an end of urban life, these technologies had marked a resurgence of urban life. One way of thinking about what happened is that globalization and technological change, right, vastly increased the returns to skill. They vastly increased the returns to innovation. And we are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people. Right? The more complicated the world is, right, the easier it is for ideas to get lost in translation. Anyone who's ever taught knows the hard part about teaching is not knowing your subject material. It's knowing whether or not anything you're saying is getting through to your students at all, right? And we have these incredible cues for communicating comprehension or confusion that are lost when we're not in the same room with one another. This is what face-to-face contact does. This is what it enables, right? And so just two images here. This is the Wallace office at Mike Bloomberg's City Hall, which is based on the Wallace office in Bloomberg's company, which is based on the Salomon Brothers trading floors. Trading floors are places where you have some of the wealthiest people on the planet who, instead of living in vast offices like university deans, right, instead of that, they're right on top of each other, right? They're yelling at each other. They're getting guacamole on each other, if Michael Lewis is to be believed, right? Why are they there? They're there, of course, because in their industry, knowledge is more important than space. And that's what's happened over the last 40 years, is that knowledge became even more valuable and people were willing to give up space to get it. If new technologies were making face-to-face contact obsolete, then why did Google buy the Googleplex? Why did all of these companies before 2019 go to such effort to make sure their workers were constantly there, constantly feeding from one another? We have a rich set of new evidence on face-to-face learning and its importance for productivity in the post-pandemic period. I'm just going to skip over that one. It's easy to forget now, but two jokers put up a billboard on the highway of Seattle asking the last person to leave the city to turn out the lights in 1971. Right? The city came back magnificently, and it came back because of skills. This is from the work of Natalia Emanuel and Emma Harrington, which follows the earlier work of Nick Bloom. Both of these studies look at call center workers who go remote. This one is in a large American retailer. Both find exactly the same thing. When you send your call center workers remotely, they can make the same number of calls. Their overall productivity at call making does not depend on being in the office. Okay? But both studies find that the probability of being promoted goes down by 50%. Okay? You turn off the learning channel when you're not in the same room with one another. This is from the work of Sonia Jaffe and her co-authors. I'll just read quickly from this abstract. Here we use rich data on the emails, calendars, instant messages, video, audio calls, and workweek hours of 62,000 US Microsoft employees over the first 6 months of 2020 to estimate the causal effects of firm-wide remote work on collaboration and communication. Our results show that firm-wide remote work caused the collaboration network of workers to become more static and siloed, with fewer bridges between disparate parts. Furthermore, there was a decrease in synchronous communication, back and forth, and an increase in asynchronous communication. Together, these effects may make it harder for employees to acquire and share new information across the network. This one shows that firms were not willing to onboard workers when they were going to be remote. On your left-hand side, these are workers who had to be live. Decline in employment with the pandemic, comes back up, both employment and hires. This is employment in remotable sectors. Red shows employment constant. Blue shows new hires stay down by 40%. The learning channel gets turned off. Last piece of evidence, right? We now have a great deal of evidence on what long-distance learning did in our K through 12 education, right? The studies are somewhat mixed, right? There's an upper bound of awful and a lower bound of absolutely cataclysmic, okay? You're somewhere between those extremes. But when I think about the actual future of the city, right, just think about the discussion of the restaurants early on, right? Many people may not be crazy to go back into their office, but they are still crazy to see each other, right? They still want to connect with one another, and the function of the city to enable people to connect with one another, to learn from one another, that remains important, right? And the only way that cities are going to succeed in this is they're going to become places that are, attractive, fun, places of joy, what I've called consumer cities, playground cities, places that actually deliver joy. I'm going to talk about one paper here, which is my current work for a second, which is one way in which cities can be a little bit more joyful, which is to have a little bit fewer potholes, okay? We have had data on how rough our highways are for the last 40 years, okay? The Department of Transportation sends out their trucks at night. They put them at a constant speed, and so they measure roughness over time. We have also had grades from the American Society of Civil Engineers, which has told us that our highways have gotten worse and worse, that we got a B- grade, which that was, I guess, the 2.5 there, and now we're down in the D range for the last 20 years. Now, I don't know quite how to reconcile this. Maybe the Society of Civil Engineers is actually a lobbying group for their own industry. But in fact, all of our measures suggest that our highways have gotten much less rough over this time period. And this actually comes from DOT's own data on road roughness. So in fact, our highways are smoother than they were by a dramatic amount over the same time that the Society of Civil Engineers tells us that we've gotten worse. But that tells us nothing about our local roads. And I don't know about those of you who do commutes that are like mine, but when I'm on the highway, it's smooth. It's just every other road I drive on is a disaster, okay? But we now have data for the whole country, or at least the whole country everywhere where Uber drives. So I have been given the universe of Uber's accelerometer data from all of their drivers, right, for 1 month in 2021. So this gives me exactly how rough all the roads are. You require a little bit of statistical legerdemain to actually signal out the things from the noise. But this is where the raw data looks like. You start off, this is an O'Hare to downtown Chicago. It's bumpy at the beginning, it's smooth on the highway, it's bumpy at the end. And there's a map of Chicago's road roughness. You can see the really sharp discontinuities at the city's border. And we can actually use that to estimate the social cost of road roughness, which we do in our paper. There's an enormous correlation with speed. So the rougher areas are much slower. This is how we actually estimate our social costs of road roughness. So this is just an example. This is at the Chicago border. It's average over all of Chicago's borders. You can see roughness drops down substantially when you leave Chicago, and speeds go dramatically up. Okay, and you can use this to figure out how much people are willing to pay to avoid bumpiness. Two last facts. It will not surprise you, especially given Matt's talk, that this correlates very strongly with both race and income. That in fact, the rougher parts of America pay significantly more in terms of the cost of road roughness than the non-poor. The black areas pay much more than the white areas. Our estimates are, and it's not in the thousands of dollars. It's about a $250 a year price tag that comes from local road roughness if you live in a 100% African American neighborhood versus living in a 100% white neighborhood. So it's about $250 more on average is our estimate. Last thing I will say, and this is Matt gave you some calls for action. I'm going to give you mine. This is, and it's just going to involve a lot less of brave fights on poverty and just more technocratic. Let's get our cities running better. Okay. What we have done is we've actually measured how likely a road is to be repaved based on how rough it is. We have 5 cities' data on this. Okay. In 4 of our cities, there is literally zero correlation between road roughness and the probability of repaving. New York has a slight correlation, okay, but it is in fact very weak. And this just is one way of envisioning this, which is if you actually, this is across the roughness deciles, right? How much are they actually being repaved versus how much should they be repaved if you're using algorithms based on either how bad it is or how bad it is times how many people are using them. Right? And as you can see, it's the red lines, which are actual, are very flat. The blue and green lines are much steeper. And so just by targeting our infrastructure better, without even spending more on it, we can actually improve our road quality. And when I think about sort of the fight for talent, the fight for cities, right, my view is not that COVID-19 and Zoom has made face-to-face contact obsolete. It's impossible to erase millions of years of evolution that fundamentally make us a social species, right? But they have made talent more global than ever. They have made talent more mobile than ever. They have made it easier to relocate. They have made it easier to move, whether or not that's to a suburb or to Austin, Texas, or somewhere else, right? Consequently, if our cities want to thrive, they need to retain that talent. At the same time, as we've all been discussing, right, they need to do more to care for their poorest residents, right? The only way to do both of those things, to retain global talent and to fight for the poorest residents, is to get better at their core jobs, whether or not that's policing or road repaving, right, or restaurant inspections, or any of the things that are crucial to government. And I think, for me at least, I'm somewhat tired of ancient arguments about whether or not America should have smaller government or larger government. Right? The critical element is to have better government. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. We have time for a few questions. While the hands are coming up, I'm going to take the chair's liberty of asking you one. When we look around at many big cities right now, there are big buildings with lots of vacant office space. And even though we hear about corporations, from law firms to tech companies that want their employees back, many employees are choosing not to come back and work elsewhere. And lots of, in addition to office spaces, lots of retail space is vacant. So I guess if you could deliver in 2 minutes or less a vision of what people are going to do in cities. I mean, it sounds incredibly puerile or unrealistic, but are they going to work? If so, what kinds of work, and what, in addition to working and eating at nice restaurants, will they be doing?
I don't see the office as being in any sense dead. I just think it needs to be nicer and, and more accommodating, right? The sin is not that New York has offices, right? The sin is that it has a vast centralized office market that makes it incredibly difficult for other people to get to, that instead of having sort of a porous fabric of urban life in which offices and residences, intermingle, you have just this one big thing, which was productive in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, right? It was productive in the 1980s, but it's not what's needed now. And so I want to just make two pitches for this, one of which is it reminds you of that the world always changes, and we want both our buildings to be as flexible as possible and our regulations to be as flexible as possible, right? Both of which are necessary. Second and related point on this, right? Matt gave you, I go back and forth on the aspects of zoning that I hate most, whether or not I hate minimum lot sizes most, or I hate mandated parking requirements most, or sometimes I just hate good old Euclidean zoning most, which was a terrible mistake that separated different uses like residences from apartment buildings. And I think really thinking about a city that is porous, that is an archipelago of neighborhoods that talk to one another is absolutely, I think, vital going forward.
Thank you. Questions? Yes, Joel.
Joel Cohen, New York City. Thank you for a wonderful talk. You showed a slide of the COVID death rate, 0.004 down to 0.001, and on the horizontal axis,
Share of college degree.
share of college graduates. In the upper right corner was New York City. Could you comment on why New York City is in the upper right corner, high BAs and high death rate?
So there are, New York is unquestionably an outlier on that. I believe this is, so there's your graph, there's New York up there. I think the right way to think about this is New York got hit early. It got hit early precisely because it was the port of entry for New York. It's the same point as Athens 2,400 years ago. The places that got it early got it before we were at all protected. Our estimates are which are precisely during the early period, were that like a 10% reduction in trips, those cell phone trips, were associated with a 20% reduction in both mortality and the prevalence of the disease. That effect is much stronger than it would be later. Right, because we would learn, we'd learn to mask, we'd get vaccines, we'd get all sorts of protective stuff. Getting the disease early was just a really bad outcome for New York, and I think that's part of what you're seeing. The other thing that's important is New York is an enormously unequal place, and so it is a lot of highly vulnerable people along with that. And that's urban inequality is. There's nothing new about it, right? I mean, it was Plato who wrote in The Republic that every city of whatever size is in reality two cities, a city of the rich and a city of the poor, and they're perpetually at war with one another. The critical element is that cities are providing escalators towards prosperity, right? And that's, in fact, to me, one of the tragedies of what we've learned about cities in recent years, particularly through the work of my colleague Raj Chetty, is that while cities are still doing a relatively good job for adults, right, in labor markets, enabling them to move up, they're doing an absolutely awful job for children. And this to me feels like the central job for cities going forward.
Questions? Any further questions?
Yes. Dan Osara from Cambridge. If I challenged you, and I would say that cities are the greatest threat for climate change. And the reason I say that is most energy is going to be driven by the poor, to connect to the first part. Renewables are distributed. So then when you start building cities, you've seen this in China, you can't power them. You can't build a huge infrastructure from the middle of China out. And so then you get susceptible to then meeting energy needs with carbon because of the increased population. What are your thoughts on that?
So the critical thing is to differentiate between wealth and density. Okay? Wealth is associated with more carbon use, and it's a hard thing to fight against. Density is typically associated with less carbon use. Right? The economic definition of a city is the absence of physical space between people. Right? It is density, it is proximity, it is closeness. We know that in the US and elsewhere as well, that density is associated with less carbon use, not more. It's associated with less carbon use because their commutes are less energy intensive, and the paper on this is mine called The Greenness of Cities, which was published 10 years ago in the Journal of Urban Economics. Right? The other fact is that they have smaller apartments holding income and family size constant. Okay? And so they're using less in their home as well. So both in terms of moving around and in terms of their home energy use, they are fundamentally greener than non-urban spaces. Now, they're not fundamentally greener than perpetual rural poverty, which is a pretty green thing, but it's also a pretty awful thing. I think that's the alternative of urbanization in China is perpetual rural poverty, right? One way of seeing this is that, in fact, if the great growing cities of India and China, the great growing economies of India and China, see their per capita carbon emissions rise to that seen in the sprawling United States, global carbon emissions go up by over 130%. If they stop at the level of wealthy but hyper-dense Hong Kong, they go up by less than 30%, right? There's a huge difference from building up versus building out. And I think that's what we need to be focused on, right? As well as everything we can think of in terms of other sensible policies around climate, which involves both research and carbon taxes. But I don't see cities as part of the problem at all. I see them as part of the solution. The only way they're part of the problem is that they're part of the way of getting out of poverty into prosperity, right? But I don't want to turn that off either. I don't want to tell I don't want a world in which India remains perpetually poor. But thank you.
Well, I think I sense a need for coffee. So on that note.